When most people speak of British history, they are in fact speaking of English history. How in 43 the Romans brought civilization to Britain before facing Boudicca's revolt. In 1066 Harold of Wessex was toppled and modern England was created, the England that won the Battle of Agincourt. How we lost one king and raised up another during a turbulent civil war, and how Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo and the Germans at the Battle of the Marne. When seen this way, it seems that British history is a very solitary one, facing the world alone and with a very isolated worldview. While some might favor this view, for various reasons, it leaves out a very complex history of interactions that have brought Britain to where it is today. Because while anyone can tell you about the Battle of Hastings, fewer can tell you about the international crisis that robbed Harold of the troops he needed to win the battle. Or about how Boudicca's revolt may have benefited from international help in fighting the Romans. About the old alliance that would have doomed any war against France fought by England, and how a minor, impoverished state played a part in the raising of the greatest empire of history. I speak, of course, of Scotland, the North, the Alba, the Picts, any of the number of cultures that have a place in British history but are often left off of the pages. Though often small and often poor, the Scots hold their own complicated interactions that would define the world. Many expanded outward from England and brought them into those interactions that would define this series and the history of Britain as a whole. We'll be looking at the kings, wars, and knaves who brought Scotland together and Britain forward. This is a history of Scotland. And now that we're past all the Ireland, it's time to justify why we're talking about a people who didn't exist doing things that don't matter. When historians write for other historians, they get to order history however they want, by theme, by place, with comparisons, and usually there's a good reason for things being this complicated hidden somewhere in that. If you ever want to read a really well-reasoned schizophrenic argument about how to tell history, try a book like John Davies' Heinz Keimreich. But because not everyone's a historian, it usually makes a lot more sense to tell history chronologically, the way most people do. Now, there's a number of different places to start counting, whether with the first written records of the formation of the modern nation, but to keep things simple, I've decided to start with the first inhabitants of Scotland, which was never. Well, rather, people arrived in Scotland sometime before the Romans, but living on an island occasionally wiped off the planet by ice storms isn't exactly conducive to long-term evidence for this. This episode might as well be short, so we'll be covering the general factors that existed before any real evidence of Scottish life came along. Why bother with this? If the evidence is largely gone, the people aren't even related to modern Scots, and there's little reason to expect they left an impact on the country. But I think that Paleolithic Scotland laid the groundwork for, if not the forces, certainly the psyche, that influenced early Scotland and filters into later periods. Scotland's past is one that's defined by struggle, and in this first episode we'll be seeing how that struggle with the environment produced a particular type of people that was reflected in succeeding generations. This episode will focus on the first great struggle in Scotland's history, the fight to establish a people and populate the land. Sometime between 1 million and 400,000 years ago, people began wandering into Sussex and Norfolk, leaving hand axes and fires around Bucksgrove and Eartham. These people were probably arriving in southern England from France, crossing a bridge of lime and condensed seashells called the Whale d'Artois Anticline, which bottled up the North Sea until it crashed through the bridge and destroyed it. This feature can still be seen in the White Cliffs of Dover, however. As the North Sea drained, it revealed a stretch of territory known as the Doggerland, which connected the Netherlands with Northumberland. This would have allowed the first real expansion into northern Britain, which we probably should define. Going back to John Davies for a minute, he characterizes Britain as divided into two areas, the south and east and the north and west. He calls the lower, more fertile territories in England the lowlands, and the more rocky, higher areas of Wales and Scotland the highlands. Since we're going to have to use these terms a lot, I'm going to refer to them instead as the British Downs and the British Uplands. While these two areas would grow increasingly diverse, at the time the first Paleolithic hunters reached the Doggerland, they were not particularly dissimilar. Both areas were heavily forested, with similarly briny, shoreline, rocky soil, and giant animals. Despite this, it seems that Paleolithic life was more focused on the marshy, fertile Doggerland and the far southeast of England, where the first truly British culture would emerge around 370,000 BC. Doggerland, being more exclusively soil, provided better hunting grounds and would have been more rapidly populated, but the abundance of stone in Britain would have allowed these hunters to gather for flint and tools. This source would have disappeared around 320,000 BC as Britain and Doggerland became distinct islands from the rest of Europe. In the place of Sussex flint, the Levallois culture would gain importance, which developed more efficient and skillful toolmaking. These improved tools, when they reached Britain, caused a revolution. It was now viable to hunt in the uplands, and the first Neanderthals seemed to appear in the Northumberland and Wales. Some may have made it as far north as the Firth of Forth, but this expansion would have been cut short by the arrival of the Ice Age, with the Vistula Glacier covering most of Britain and northern Europe. It would be 50,000 years before Neanderthals returned to upland Britain, but this time they would not be alone. The first modern humans, arguably the first Britons, began to filter across the Doggerland and rapidly replaced their cousins. By 36,000 BC, the Mousterian culture in Wales marks the arrival of the Upper Paleolithic age to the uplands. It still seems that the only people in Scotland at this time were just passing hunters, moving between Wales and Ireland, but there was a developing culture in Britain that became distinct from that on the continent, even that from Doggerland. But what this culture was like is difficult to say. It lasted about 15,000 years, but the Younger Dryas Ice Age swept towards London and would have forced these people to move. During this relative dark period, however, a significant change reached Britain: the red deer. Hardy and living in large herds, the red deer would become a central food source for the hunters of Britain and Scotland in particular. In Scotland, it would be honoured well into the Celtic Age for its importance. When the ice retreated far enough north for the habitation of Ireland and Scotland around 10,000 BC, the red deer allowed their hunter cultures to thrive, but evidence of a struggle with neighbouring Achenbergians and the culture thereof speaks to another aspect of the Scottish experience: war with the neighbours for land. Around 9000 BC, connection with Ireland was cut, and at the end of the last ice age, disaster struck. Rising water levels, retreating seas, and depleted animal populations would have destroyed the hunting ecosystems that Scots had based their lives around. The Upper Paleolithic period came crashing down around 8300 BC, and this could easily have spelled the end of the Scottish culture, as had the weather so many times before. But as with Levallois tools, technology allowed Scotland to survive desolation, this time barbs and twine. Introduced from Doggerland probably as pursuit tools for hunting down large beasts, it proved incredibly useful at making nets and fishing line, which developed in the uplands. Shellfish and spears for fishing had been used before, but now living off the sea became a viable way to support population, and as the hunting lands of Scotland were empty, many people began to settle along the coast, eking out a life that would have accomplished something very remarkable: the establishment of a population in Scotland, one that would shape the world for another 5,000 years.